Dust drifted across the dead star system, and nothing in it had moved for 100 years. That was what the sensors of the Coalition ship's second light said, right up until the moment they were wrong. A low signal blinked on the screen. It was weak, almost buried under static, but it was there. Officer Dore leaned forward in her chair and frowned at the reading. She had flown through this sector twice before and never picked up anything but empty rock and cold light. Now there was a shape on her screen, huge and slow, tumbling gently near a burned-out star. "That is not on any chart," said her navigator, a thin alien with pale blue skin and too many fingers. He tapped the console twice, as if that would make the shape disappear. It did not. Dore ordered a closer scan. The results came back strange. The object was enormous, larger than most Coalition warships, but its outer hull did not look like metal alone. Threads of something organic ran across its surface, thick as tree roots, weaving in and out of old plating. Heat signatures glowed faintly from deep inside it, dozens of them, moving in slow, steady patterns, not machines, living things. Then the computer gave its final verdict, and the bridge went quiet. Classification, Class 15, DATHWOLD origin confirmed, do not approach. Every Coalition officer learned about Class 15 in their first year of training. It was the highest danger rating in the galaxy, given only to ships or stations that had grown from or been taken over by life from a Deathworld, a planet so hostile that nothing should survive there, yet somehow always did. Class 15 objects were supposed to be reported and avoided. Coalition law was clear. Contact them, and you risked infection, invasion, or worse. Most captains who found one simply marked the coordinates and left as fast as their engines allowed. Dore did not leave. She told herself it was curiosity. In truth, it was something closer to disbelief. The readings did not match anything in the manuals. A true Class 15 threat was supposed to be chaotic, hostile, spreading without pattern. This thing pulsed with rhythm, almost like breathing. The organic threads on the hull were not spreading wildly. They followed neat lines, like veins in a leaf. Someone or something had shaped them on purpose. Her crew argued. The ship's doctor, a squat and serious alien named Vren, insisted they turn away immediately and report the coordinates to the Deathworld Containment Authority, as regulations demanded. The navigator agreed, his 4 eyes wide with worry. But Dore had spent 15 years chasing mysteries across the stars, and she was not about to hand this one over to a report she would never get to read. "We send a small team," she said. "Suits sealed, weapons ready. If it moves wrong, we leave. If it doesn't, we look." 3 hours later, a shuttle detached from the second light and crossed the dark gap toward the drifting hulk. Up close, the ship was even stranger than the scans suggested. Its outer shell had clearly once been a Coalition design, old, blocky, and heavily armored, the kind used decades ago for prisoner transport. But now half of it was wrapped in living material, pale green and silver, pulsing faintly with warmth. Sections of hull had been replaced entirely by something that looked grown rather than built, seamless and strong. The boarding team found an opening where a cargo bay door had rusted through and been patched with woven fiber, tough as steel cable. They stepped inside cautiously, weapons raised, expecting darkness and hostility. Instead, they found light. Soft bioluminescent growth ran along the corridor walls, glowing a gentle blue-green, enough to see by without any need for standard lighting. The air, when their suit sensors checked it, was breathable. More than breathable, clean, faintly sweet, like a forest after rain. Vines curled along support beams, but they were trimmed, tended, clearly cared for rather than left wild. Then came the sound of footsteps, not the shuffle of some strange creature, but the steady, ordinary steps of someone walking without fear. A figure rounded the corner ahead. To Dore's shock, it was humanoid, wrapped in simple woven clothing, carrying a basket of what looked like grown fruit. The figure stopped, looked at the armed strangers in their suits, and did not run. It did not scream. It simply tilted its head, curious, the way someone might look at an unexpected guest rather than an invading force. "Coalition," the figure said calmly, in accented but clear trade language. "You are far from your lanes." Dore lowered her weapon slightly, stunned into silence. Behind the first figure, more shapes appeared in the glowing corridor, Men, women, children, all human, all calm, all watching the newcomers with more curiosity than fear. This was supposed to be a Class 15 Deathworld horror. Instead, it looked like a village. "What is this place?" Dore finally managed to ask. The figure smiled, small and proud. "This is the Warren," they said. "It is our home." Dore stood frozen in the glowing corridor, surrounded by living walls and quiet human faces, and understood in that moment that everything the Coalition believed about Class 15 ships was about to be proven wrong. The woman who led Dore deeper into the Warren was not young, but she moved with the steady confidence of someone who had walked these corridors her whole life. Her name was Ruth, and the humans aboard called her the Keeper, though she waved off the title whenever a child used it too formally. "It just means I remember where everything is," she said, getting the small Coalition team past a wall thick with woven roots. "And I settle arguments about who gets the last of the good fruit." Dore found it hard to reconcile the woman in front of her with the warning still blinking somewhere in her mind. Class 15, Deathworld origin, do not approach. Yet here was Ruth, speaking calmly, walking without a weapon, leading strangers through her home without a hint of fear. The corridors told a story of their own. The Warren had clearly once been a Coalition vessel, and an old one at that, a prisoner transport ship, judging by the shape of the cell blocks they passed, though the bars had long since been removed and the rooms turned into living quarters. Metal walls that must have once been cold and grey were now threaded through with living material, strong fibers that pulsed faintly with warmth, and thick vines that curled along the ceiling like natural wiring. "This ship was condemned," Ruth explained when Dore asked. "A long time ago, there was trouble on board. The people running it back then did not treat their prisoners well, and the prisoners did something about it. The Coalition of that time didn't want the mess. They cut this ship loose out here and marked it lost, forgot about it." "But you didn't die," Dore said quietly. "No," Ruth agreed, "we didn't." She led them into a wide chamber that had clearly once been a cargo hold. Now it was something between a garden and a workshop. Children sat cross-legged near thick green vines, carefully tying off new growth with practiced hands. An older man worked at a bench nearby, shaping metal salvaged from broken equipment into simple tools. Along one wall, pale insects moved in slow, organized lines, tending to patches of fungus that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Our ancestors found a moon nearby," Ruth said. "A hard place, nothing friendly lived there, but some of it could be used if you were patient and careful. They brought back spores, seeds, insects that could survive almost anything. It took generations to learn how to live with it instead of against it." Dore stared at the fungus glowing softly on the wall. "This repairs the hull." "When it can," Ruth said. "It seals small cracks, slows leaks. It isn't magic. It just doesn't give up easily. Neither did we." One of Dore's crew, the nervous navigator, flinched as a child ran past, chasing what looked like a large armored insect the size of a fist. "Is that safe?" he asked, voice tight. Ruth laughed, warm and unbothered. "Safer than most things out here. That one eats mold, not fingers." She glanced at the child fondly. "The kids know which creatures are friends and which ones to leave alone. They learn early. Out here you learn fast, or you don't get the chance to learn slow." As they walked further, Dore noticed something she had not expected: order. Nothing about the Warren was random or wild, despite what her scans had suggested. Every vine, every growth of fungus, every insect colony had a purpose, tended and guided by generations of careful hands. The Coalition's warnings had painted a picture of chaos and danger. What Dore saw instead was patience. They passed a room where several children sat listening to an old woman tell a story about the first ones. The original prisoners who had refused to let the ship become their coffin. The story was told simply, without anger, more like a lesson in how to survive than a tale of revenge. "You could have asked the Coalition for help," Dore said eventually, unable to hold the question back. "Reported your position, asked to come home." Ruth's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes grew a little harder. "This is home," she said simply, "and the last time people like us asked the Coalition for help, they answered by locking the doors and leaving us to die in the dark. We stopped asking a long time ago. Dore had no answer for that. They reached a wide viewing port near what had once been the ship's bridge. Through the thick, patched glass, the dead star cast a dim red light over the endless dark of space. Ruth stood beside Dore, looking out at it the way someone looks at a familiar backyard. "You came here expecting monsters," Ruth said quietly. "I understand that. Your warnings aren't wrong about most Class 15 ships. Life like that, left alone, usually does turn ugly." She turned to face Dore directly. "But we were never alone. We had each other, and that made all the difference." Dore looked around at the humming, living ship, at the glowing fungus and quiet insects and children laughing somewhere down the corridor, and understood, with a growing weight in her chest, that she was about to have to explain all of this to superiors who would not want to believe a word of it. "I have to report what I found," she said carefully. Ruth nodded, unsurprised. "I know," she said. "Just try to remember what you actually saw, not what the file said you'd find." Dore promised she would try. She did not yet know how hard that promise would be to keep. The report took Dore 6 hours to write and less than 6 minutes to be misunderstood. She had chosen her words with care, describing the Warren not as a threat but as a home, a community of humans who had turned a condemned prison ship into something alive and self-sustaining. She included images of the tended gardens, the careful insect colonies, the calm faces of children who had never known anything but this drifting world of metal and vine. She used the word civilization more than once. The reply from Coalition Command came back within the hour, and it did not use the word civilization at all. Class 15 threat confirmed, containment protocol authorized, stand by for task force arrival. Dore read the message twice, then a third time, hoping the words would change. They did not. Somewhere in a coalition office far from the dead star system, a committee had looked at sensor readings and a single word, Deathworld, and made their decision before anyone had finished reading her report. "They didn't even ask about the people," she said quietly to her navigator, staring at the screen. "They rarely do," he replied, not unkindly. "Rules exist, so no one has to think too hard about exceptions." Dore sent a second message, more urgent than the first, pleading for the task force to be delayed until a proper review could be done. The response came back even faster than before, short and final. Her request was denied. Worse, she was ordered to withdraw from the system immediately and await further instructions. The matter, as far as Coalition Command was concerned, was no longer a discovery. It was a cleanup operation. Dore did not withdraw, not yet. While she argued with distant superiors, the story of the Warren was already spreading far beyond official channels. A junior officer on the second light, excited and careless, had shared parts of the scanned data with a friend on another ship. That friend told someone else. Within 2 days, word of a human-inhabited Deathworld vessel, hidden and untouched for decades, had reached every corner of the sector where people made a living finding things others didn't want found. Smugglers heard it first, and their eyes lit up at the thought of biotechnology no lab had ever studied, living hull repair, Deathworld organisms that could be tamed and controlled. Such things could be sold for a fortune to the right buyers, no questions asked. Mercenary crews heard it next, calculating that a ship full of untrained civilians, however strange their home, would make an easy target with a valuable prize inside. And further out, in territories the Coalition did not fully control, rival factions heard the story and grew quietly interested in something far more troubling than technology. Humans who could survive Deathworld conditions, humans who had thrived where nothing should live at all. To some of those listening, that was not just valuable. It was dangerous if it belonged to the wrong side, and it was very useful if it belonged to the right one. Ruth felt the change before anyone explained it to her. The Warren had long-range sensors of its own, built and rebuilt over generations from salvaged Coalition tech, patched together with stubborn ingenuity. For the first time in decades, those sensors picked up multiple ships, adjusting course toward the dead system, none of them Coalition military, all of them moving with the quiet purpose of people who thought they had found something worth taking. She called the ship's council together in the old cargo hold that served as their meeting place. It was a simple gathering, no ranks, no ceremony, just tired and determined faces sitting in a circle beneath the glowing fungus light. Ruth laid out what she knew plainly, the way she always did. "We are not hidden anymore," she said. "The Coalition knows, and it seems half the galaxy heard the Coalition talking." She let that settle over the room before continuing. "Some of what's coming wants to destroy us because they're afraid of what we are. Some of it wants to take us because they're greedy for what we've built. Either way, it comes to the same thing." An older man, one of the ship's engineers, spoke up. "We could run, push the engines harder than we ever have, try to lose ourselves in deep space again." Ruth shook her head slowly. This ship wasn't built for outrunning anything. It was built for surviving in place. That's what it's always done. That's what it's good at. She looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "We are not the first people to be hunted for what we are instead of what we've done. Our ancestors survived worse odds than this, on a moon that wanted them dead every single day. We are not going to lose our home now, after everything it took to build it." There were nods around the circle, quiet but firm. Children too young to fully understand the danger still understood the mood in the room and settled close to their parents. Outside, in the dark beyond the Warren's patched hull, ships continued their slow approach, some hungry for profit, one following orders it did not fully believe in, and somewhere among them, a coalition task force preparing for what its briefing called containment. None of them were prepared for what the Warren had already survived, long before any of them arrived. The mercenary flotilla arrived first, 3 battered ships painted in mismatched colors, crewed by fighters who had heard old prison hulk full of primitives and pictured an easy payday. Their captain, a lean alien named Sorek with a reputation for taking jobs no one else wanted, brought his ships in close and ordered a simple boarding assault. No negotiation, no warning shots, just doors forced open and cargo hauled out before anyone could organize a defense. It did not go the way he expected. The first boarding pod cut into the Warren's outer hull near what looked like an unguarded maintenance shaft. The mercenaries inside expected darkness and easy corridors. Instead, the moment their pod breached the wall, thick spore clouds burst from hidden vents along the ceiling, clogging air filters and shorting out unshielded electronics in seconds. Half the boarding team's weapons went dead before they took 10 steps. Deeper in, a second team found the corridors themselves working against them. Panels that looked like ordinary wall sections shifted and folded, narrowing passages into dead ends or opening sudden drops into lower decks lined with thick, tangled roots that slowed a fall but made climbing back out nearly impossible without help. The ship they were raiding did not fight like a fortress with guns. It fought like a living thing that knew exactly where its intruders were and exactly how uncomfortable it could make their day. Ruth stood in the central hub of the Warren, watching reports come in from residents stationed at key points throughout the ship. There were no soldiers among her people, not in the way the Coalition would understand the word. There were parents who knew every hidden vent, children who knew which vines reacted badly to unfamiliar footsteps, and elders who remembered exactly how their ancestors had turned a death trap of a ship into a home that bit back against anyone who meant it harm. "Third team is stuck in the lower ring," reported a young woman monitoring a bank of old, patched screens. "The vines have them boxed in good." "Let them sit a while," Ruth said calmly. "No one gets hurt if they stop pushing forward." That was the strange truth the mercenaries slowly discovered, corridor by corridor. The Warren's defenses were rarely lethal by design. They stalled, trapped, confused, and exhausted intruders far more often than they killed them. It was not mercy exactly. It was practicality. Generations of hard lessons had taught the people of the Warren that killing brought retaliation, but making an enemy waste hours crawling through spore-choked, root-tangled dead ends usually sent a clearer message: leave. Sorek, watching the disaster unfold from his ship, finally understood the message. 2 of his boarding teams were stuck, disoriented, and low on breathable air in their damaged suits. A third had simply refused to go any further after radio contact from the first 2 teams turned into panicked, garbled static. He had lost credibility, equipment, and nearly a dozen fighters to what his employer had promised would be an easy raid on primitives. He pulled his ships back before nightfall on the ship's internal clock, leaving behind broken pods and a story that would spread just as fast through mercenary circles as the original rumor had. The Warren was not defenseless. It was something far stranger and far more dangerous than an easy target. There was little time to celebrate. Barely a day later, Coalition sensors detected the second light's warnings had been correct about one thing at least. A proper task force was inbound. 5 heavily armed Coalition vessels moving in tight formation, nothing like Sorik's disorganized raiders. This was not greed arriving at the Warren's door. This was policy, cold and procedural, backed by real firepower and real training. Ruth gathered her council again, faces tighter than before. The mercenary attack had been survivable because it was chaotic and poorly planned. A Coalition task force would not make the same mistakes. "They'll have shielded suits," said the ship's engineer grimly. "Spores won't slow them down for long, weapons that don't short out so easy." "They'll also have orders," Ruth said. "Orders to destroy, not capture. That means they won't be careful the way looters are careful. They'll come in heavy and they'll come in fast." A young man near the back of the room, barely old enough to remember any life before helping tend the fungus gardens, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Can we survive that?" Ruth did not answer with false comfort. She had learned long ago that her people deserved honesty more than hope built on nothing. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we have survived worse than most people believe possible, for longer than most people would think we could. We are not going to stop fighting for this ship just because the next enemy is bigger." Outside, the task force closed the distance, engines burning steady and disciplined against the dark. Inside the Warren, humans who had spent their whole lives learning how to survive impossible odds began, once again, to prepare their home for a war they had never asked for. The Dead Star watched on in silence, as it had for 100 years, indifferent to which side would still be standing when the fighting ended. Commander Yeshill had led containment operations for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never once questioned an order until the moment she stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring at live footage from Officer Dore's original survey. Children, gardens, an old woman telling stories to a circle of quiet, listening faces. It did not look like the threat described in her briefing packet. She pushed the doubt aside. Orders were orders, and Class-15 designations existed for good reason. Sentiment could not be allowed to override protocol, not when the cost of being wrong could mean an uncontrolled Deathworld outbreak spreading across a dozen systems. She gave the order to hold formation at the edge of the Dead Star system and prepare for a full sweep. It was Dore who stopped her, though not with authority. Dore had none left to use. She had been quietly relieved of field command the moment she filed her second report, the one that used words like civilization and home instead of threat and outbreak. What she had instead was a shuttle, a stubborn streak, and a decision to make. She flew straight into the middle of the task force's formation, transmitting on an open channel loud enough that every ship in range could hear. "This is former Survey Officer Dore," she said, voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "Before you fire a single shot, I am requesting, not ordering, because I have no right to order anyone anymore, that you review the full survey data yourselves, not the summary, not the classification stamp, the actual footage." Commander Yeshill could have ignored her. Regulation gave her every right to. But something about the desperation in Dore's voice, paired with the memory of that footage already sitting uncomfortably in her mind, made her pause long enough to open the full file instead of the summary. She watched children playing near carefully tended vines. She watched an old man shaping tools with careful, practiced hands. She watched a woman named Ruth calmly explain, to strangers holding weapons, exactly how her people had survived for 3 generations without a single outside hand to help them. It did not erase the danger a true Deathworld outbreak could pose, but it made Yeshill's next question unavoidable. Was this that danger, or was it something else entirely, wrongly filed under the same warning label out of fear and habit? She made a decision that would follow her for the rest of her career. She ordered the task force to hold position and requested, against direct standing orders, a neutral science team be sent in first, unarmed, to verify the true nature of the Warren before any containment action was taken. Inside the Warren, Ruth received the message relayed through Dore's shuttle with a mixture of relief and wariness. A pause was not a victory, it was simply time, and time could be used well or wasted. She chose to use it. Rather than hide her people's methods, Ruth opened sections of the ship that had never been shown to any outsider. The deep growing chambers where the original Deathworld spores had first been tamed. The careful records kept across generations documenting exactly which organisms helped and which had to be removed. The long, patient history of trial and failure that had turned a condemned prison ship into something that worked with its passengers instead of against them. "You wanted proof we aren't a weapon," Ruth told the small, nervous science team that arrived aboard an unarmed shuttle 2 days later. "Here it is. Every mistake we made, every lesson we learned the hard way. We are not hiding anything anymore. We have nothing left to hide." The science team, made up of researchers who studied ecosystems rather than soldiers who studied threats, spent 3 full days moving through the Warren with growing astonishment. What they documented was not chaos barely held at bay, but genuine balance, a self-sustaining relationship between human ingenuity and Deathworld biology, refined over decades into something stable, deliberate, and remarkably safe. Their final report reached Commander Yeshel with a conclusion that contradicted the very classification that had brought her fleet to the edge of this system in the first place. Class-15 designation inaccurate. Recommend reclassification. No containment threat present. Yeshel read it twice, then called Ruth directly, ship to ship, for the first true conversation between the Warren and the Coalition in over 100 years. "Your people built something no lab could have designed on purpose," Yeshel admitted, her voice careful but honest. "I was prepared to destroy it because a label told me to be afraid." "Most people are," Ruth replied, without bitterness. "We stopped waiting for anyone to look past the label a long time ago. It's the only reason we're still here to have this conversation." Yeshel did not apologize, not exactly. Some things ran too deep in Coalition training for a single conversation to undo, but she gave Ruth something almost as valuable, an honest promise to carry the truth back to Coalition Command herself, rather than let it get buried in another summary stamped with the wrong warning. It was not victory yet. Politics moved slower than truth, and old fears did not vanish simply because new evidence arrived. But for the first time since the ghost signal had first appeared on Dore's screen, the Warren was no longer being hunted in silence. It was finally being seen. Word travels strangely through the Coalition. It moves slowly through official channels, buried under committees and stamped reports, but it moves fast through the people who actually witnessed the truth firsthand. By the time Commander Yeshel's honest account reached Coalition Command, pieces of the real story had already spread through the ranks of her own fleet, carried home by soldiers who had seen the footage of children and gardens with their own eyes and could not unsee it. The debate that followed was long and at times ugly. Some officials in Coalition Command dug in hard, insisting that any exception made for the Warren would open the door to chaos. The Deathworld classifications existed precisely so no one had to make emotional judgment calls about individual cases. Others argued just as hard that a system built to protect the galaxy from danger had nearly destroyed a peaceful, self-sufficient community out of nothing more than fear and outdated paperwork. Dore found herself, unexpectedly, at the center of it all. Stripped of her old rank but unwilling to disappear quietly, she testified before a Coalition review panel, laying out everything she had seen from the first ghost signal to the final science report. She spoke plainly, without exaggeration, letting the facts carry the weight her rank no longer could. "I was trained to see a warning label and stop asking questions," she told the panel. "I stopped anyway. I am asking all of you to do the same." It was not her testimony alone that changed things. It was the weight of everything together, Yeshel's report, the science team's findings, and a growing unwillingness among younger officers to enforce a rule that had almost erased an entire community for the crime of surviving somewhere it wasn't supposed to. In the end, Coalition Command did not fully abandon its caution. Old fears rarely disappear completely, but under mounting pressure, they agreed to something new, a provisional classification, recognizing the Warren not as a Class 15 threat, but as an independent settlement, self-governed and protected from further containment action, so long as it posed no danger to surrounding systems. It was not full citizenship. It was not a warm welcome. But it was, for the first time in 100 years, official acknowledgement that the people of the Warren had a right to exist. Ruth received the news standing in the same viewing port where she had once stood beside Dore, looking out at the dim red light of the dead star. She read the message twice, slowly, feeling the weight of 3 generations settle somewhere behind her ribs. "We're not hiding anymore," she said quietly to no one in particular. Life aboard the Warren changed after that, though not as quickly or as dramatically as some had feared or others had hoped. A handful of Coalition researchers, granted formal permission this time, returned to study the ship's ecosystem properly, working alongside the residents rather than around them. Traders began arriving cautiously, offering supplies in exchange for a chance to see the strange, thriving balance between metal and living growth that no shipyard had ever managed to plan on purpose. Some visitors came only to look, curious about the place the whole sector had briefly called the most hunted ship in space. The children of the Warren, who had grown up hiding their home from outsiders, now watched strangers walk their glowing corridors with open curiosity instead of fear. It was strange for them at first, then simply became part of life, the way most changes eventually do. Ruth remained keeper, though she often joked that the job had grown busier now that half the galaxy wanted a tour. She still walked the corridors every day, checking on the fungus growth, listening to disputes over garden space, watching new visitors arrive with the same mixture of caution and wonder she remembered from Dore's first visit. One evening, standing near the same patched viewport where it had all truly begun, Ruth watched a small Coalition transport approach, carrying another group of researchers eager to understand a ship that should not have worked, built by people who should not have survived. She thought about her ancestors, prisoners once condemned and abandoned, who had refused to let a graveyard become their end. The Warren had never been built as a weapon, despite what fear and rumor had once called it. It had never been built to threaten anyone. It had been built, patiently and stubbornly, out of nothing but refusal. A refusal to disappear quietly, a refusal to let hardship win, a refusal to stop calling a condemned ship home simply because the rest of the galaxy said it shouldn't be possible. As the transport docked and new voices echoed faintly through the glowing corridors, Ruth allowed herself a small, tired smile. The Warren had been hunted, feared, and nearly destroyed for being different. It had endured anyway. It always would.